My name is Michelle Harrell, and I'm from the North Carolina Museum of Art, and I'm excited to share with you what we've learned about how distance learning can address the needs of tomorrow's learners. And I'm going to do that by touching on a couple of different points. First, a research study, a 2-year planning grant that we conducted with the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services into the needs of tomorrow's learners. And then secondly, sharing 3 of the prototypes that came from that planning project that will give you a variety of how we approach distance learning, both asynchronous forms like Moodle that just came about. I'm going to touch on some of the platforms that we've used and what we've learned from that, as well as synchronous live sessions, like what Ed just talked about in the virtual field trips. So I'm going to touch on different audiences, both students and teachers, and give you a span of what we do. But first, obviously, I came from far away. How many of you have been to the States? Just curious. Excellent. How about to North Carolina? So I have a southern accent. It's not Southwest. I've been asked several times, am I from Texas? But I am from the East Coast here. North Carolina Museum of Art is located in Raleigh, which is the capital city of North Carolina. We are a 2.5-hour drive to the Atlantic Beach and 3 hours from the Appalachian Mountains. It's a beautiful location sort of in the middle of the state, somewhat in the middle of the Southeast as well. And we're a state-funded museum, which presents an interesting challenge of reaching the entire state. Therefore, nothing replaces the idea of being with authentic works of art in a gallery setting, but it's a real challenge to get students all over the state to our museum. And really, distance learning has been in museums for a very long time. Slide sets and correspondence programs. We have been using distance learning in some form or another for many years. In fact, I came to the museum 7 years ago to manage a grant-funded program to create online courses with a state virtual public school system. We now have 5 online high school courses that run for a semester. They get high school credit for them, courses like game design, photography, fashion. We just had 250 students that concluded the semester a couple of weeks ago. So giving you a sense of why distance learning is so important, that grant that I managed was coming to an end about the same time that several other grant-funded programs were coming about. At the end of 5 years after a capital campaign that I'm not sure we'll ever be able to repeat again. So we began to look at all these distinct projects and what comes next. What will we do after these grants end? And looking at how online learning was allowing for us to increase the impact and the access of our learners through all these different projects, we felt the need to sort of come together and look at that strategically. So fortunately, we received this 2-year planning grant to do that. All the grant-funded managers came together, dedicated 50% of our time over those 2 years to this planning project while still running our grant-funded programs. So it was integrated into everything that we did. Planning process that would allow for us to plan what we didn't know what we were going to end up with in 2 years. So we looked at the design process, and also just responding to the fact that our learners were changing too. Not only internally did we have this need because of grant funds ending, but the landscape of education has changed so much because of technology, social media, learning environments in the galleries, and we needed to be able to respond to that as well. So for looking at the process, we looked at the design thinking model and a number of different design thinking models. So how many of you are somewhat familiar with design thinking, design process, Excellent. So there's a lot of different models, but what we chose was based on Boston Museum's Engineering is Elementary program, which is also used by the North Carolina State University Engineering program, which is right down the street from our museum. To ask, imagine, plan, and create a series of prototypes that would respond to what we learned from our learners during the ask phase, and then to be able to improve those. And what we did with our process that was slightly different from Boston and NC State University is that we embedded a mini design process within each of these phases. And that was as simple as paper prototypes and post-it notes and constantly involving visitor research and audience research into every single phase of what we did. So each phase lasted from 3 to 6 months, with the ask phase lasting just a little bit longer than that. And it was highly collaborative. We involved those 4 project managers as co-managers. Talk about having multiple stakeholders being a problem. I know Drew was talking about that earlier. It was truly a collaborative open source experience. We also created a collaborative planning team using educators from across the state that represented every grade level, every subject area, and that also brought different perspectives to how they have used the museum in the past. Different members of teacher workshops as well as instructors of different programs. Then we also included a panel of national thought leaders, and these were some experts in the field of museum education, one artist from our collection, Hank Willis Thomas, a number of people from our state, but then also national experts that weighed in at every point in the project to sort of guide our thinking and keep us thinking more globally and picking up on trends that we might have missed otherwise. So during this ask phase, we had a number of different conversations and interviews, first with this team and the national thought partners, as well as our museum staff. That was interesting. Asking these same questions to our museum educators, and then asking security, housekeeping, directors, curatorial, what do you see as trends in the classroom, and what role do you see our museum playing in supporting that learning? It was an eye-opening experience, to say the least. The teachers that were part of this collaborative planning team also asked these questions to their students. So we have the student voice incorporated throughout this project, as well as multiple conferences, multiple social media. We gathered data from about 300 plus participants throughout this. Lots of post-it notes that were then color-coded and organized into patterns that we found that were repeating. And I'll give you a couple of examples of the responses that we received, where you can start to see some of these trends. So looking at powerful changes and things that are coming. Again, Drew talked about how difficult it is to plan for the future. But when half of your programs are supported by grants, you sometimes don't have a choice, that you have to think in that way of how do you plan for the future when we don't know what that's going to bring for us. But we picked up on a number of different patterns through this, looking at learning environments, the museum as a learning environment, also looking at collaboration. Hank Willis Thomas's comments up on the top right-hand side that sort of echo the idea of what Paul was referring to earlier, the DIWO, the do it yourself and do with others program. So incorporating these trends and things that we were looking at into patterns, we came up with a series of needs. So the 4 top student needs that we found, and the 4 top teacher needs. And I've got these elaborated upon in the handout that I'll upload so that you guys can see all of this. But what we mean by time was something that Naomi and Sarah referred to earlier in the day. Teachers are time poor. Teachers are constantly looking for opportunities to differentiate within their classroom, to have more time with different students, time management, things to save time, ways to have professional development that meets their busy schedules. So all of these things were factored into what we called time. Then I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I sort of come back to some of them as we come back to the actual prototypes. But these were the needs that we developed at the very beginning that would serve as the criteria for everything that we do from this point forward. And we developed this framework to plan these prototypes based on common goals that we established during the ask phase on existing programs. This is sort of our framework for how we engage visitors. These are the things that we do really well, very interdisciplinary, participant-driven meaning making, constructive thought processes, interpersonal skills. All of these things are important. And these are the shared resources, the how and where that we do it. Because up until this point, these different grant-funded projects were mostly run by contractors. So it's a built-in silo system that had developed with very little shared resources. And then, of course, audience development and continuing to serve our current audience, but though the funds and the resources to develop this would decrease significantly, looking at expanding that audience and continuing to grow. And you can see here at the bottom is a framework that I'm going to expand on the next slide, where we looked at 10 different prototypes that we were going to create through this create phase of our project. And that each of these met multiple needs, because collectively no one program can address all the needs of your users. So collectively we have a menu of programs that we were piloting to see how each one of them could do it. Couple of them that were met by all of the prototypes. One, the idea of proof and contributing to the field and having significant research that looks at the impact of what we were doing, as well as collaborate, and actually proof also, as far as on the need definition, also referred to what teachers said they wanted proof to show their principals. Why is it important to come to a field trip? Why is it important for me to invest in this professional development experience at a museum? Collaborators was something that we felt was natural to integrate into every single prototype in a variety of different ways. And much of that comes from the fact that we are very interdisciplinary. Arts integration was something that we focus on, not just the art teachers, but across the disciplines, and having teachers to begin to work together, as well as students being able to work together on some of these projects was something that was an easy need for all. But the three, I'm not going to talk about all 10 of these prototypes. I'm going to zoom in, as I could easily talk about learning spaces, both in the museum and online. That was one of the things that we did. And some of these programs were huge failures, but we've learned so much that not only is impacting what we're doing now, but the next phase of things that will come. So the three that I've chosen to sort of talk about that we did during our create phase, the three distance learning formats, one was pre-existing in a different form, and that was a blended learning approach before and after a field trip. The second was a virtual field trip, and then the third was a teacher professional development format that involved asynchronous forms of learning. So first, talk about failure. I wrote with Emily Kotecki and published The Flipped Museum as the first prototype in blended learning in the Journal of Museum Education in 2015. And that was, in many ways, though we're so glad that we did it, a huge failure, because we risked so much for such a small audience. But it really has informed so much of what we did. We decided, because we wanted to maximize that gallery experience, how could we use distance learning before and after a field trip to give the quality of learning that a multi-visit program might give? So we chose at ends of the state, and they participated in an online course environment before, for 2 or 3 weeks before coming to the museum, and then they also participated together online after it. So that was a failure in some ways, but it did result in, that was a little bit more because you wanted me to expand on the failure thing. this format that we are continuing to revise and improve. So to have this one is Artist in Process, and we learned from the first one that narrowing our topic to photography, the idea of the very first pilot that we did in 2015 was looking at contemporary photographers and how they look at social issues. It was a deep and highly meaningful program, but it did not allow teachers to incorporate this into their subject areas easily. So we needed something much more flexible and something that also allowed them, if they wanted to do 2 days before their field trip or 2 months, that we had the kind of content that could expand and fit their needs. So we developed this flipped museum approach. And I've said flipped museum without explaining what it is. Have you ever heard of the flipped classroom model? So teachers are using this to record videos of their lecture that students would watch at home. And then when they come to the classroom, they have an active form of learning, what in the past might have been homework to apply learning, but they get to work in small groups in the classroom. So that's the flipped classroom idea. Flipped museum is based along that same idea. We've been doing it for years with pre and post activities, but this is just incorporating distance learning, so it's a little bit more customized and meaningful. So this is the blended learning format. Second prototype was virtual field trips. So this addressed, and I didn't speak about the needs, but obviously there were the needs of time, flexibility, student engagement in the blended learning format. So for virtual field trips, we worked with our Egyptologists, and we scanned 2 of our ancient Egyptian objects. We sent the image files to one of the collaborative planning team members' classes, and the students printed out the 3D replica of this Egyptian faience, this amulet, while the Egyptian curator talked to them about it. So they were physically passing around and handling the replica while the curator was standing in the galleries talking to them and answering questions about it. So this responded to the need for these teachers that are developing maker spaces and looking for high quality experiences to use this new technology in ways that was meaningful and relevant, incorporating that level of tinkering, that need for play and experimentation. One of the things that we definitely learned from this, it was wonderful having the curator there on site for all of this, but to be able to sustain and increase the scale of this program, we have her now videotaped and talking about these objects, and it's facilitated by a museum educator. The third prototype that I'm going to refer to is talking about the need for high-quality professional development for teachers. And as a state museum, we provide that for thousands of teachers each year. We wanted to see how we could use distance learning in a somewhat of a blended format, but to let them customize just what they wanted to do, how they wanted to learn it. If teachers wanted to take an online course, they could take the online course in and of itself, and that was one experience. They wanted to take the Saturday workshop, they could take just that. But they could take both for additional continuing education credits and that blended experience to scaffold learning and have an even deeper and richer experience. Again, there were some things that we are definitely going to improve when we repeat this program. It will be next summer before we repeat it. Definitely wouldn't consider this a failure, but it was more complicated than we expected to really scaffold learning. We first called this a blended format, and we really decided, this isn't really blended as much as it is customized. The number of teachers that were taking both elements of this for that deep blended experience was actually a small minority of the program, that it needed to be able to function both online and independently at the museum separately. But we have lots of ideas of how to be able to do this and integrate this into our website that we've also developed. That's one of the prototypes, part of this project. So the on-site, just to back up a little bit, and this will let me address some of the asynchronous forms of distance learning. So our online course environments that we've played with since I came to the museum 7 years ago. We first, working with the high school courses, we first were in Blackboard, and then we moved to Moodle, and then Canvas. These are all learning management platforms that allow you to have an entire course that is self-paced, that they can go to anytime that they want to and go through modules. We, about 3 years ago, developed our own platform with a startup company outside of Raleigh that allowed the platform to look like Pinterest. We wanted it to have a social media feel and to be really dynamic because we're an image museum. We wanted images to be a high part of that program. What we learned, though, is that there's benefits of working with a big company, that when there are changes and updates in the field, that they will happen automatically, not just for you going to the developer and saying, now we'd like to update this. So we are now moving to a new platform called Schoology, another US company that we're using for both student and teacher online courses. So teachers literally logged into the course platform and they were able to create these concept maps. Much of our educational approach is based on concept learning. We have a concept map tool on our Art&C website where they use one concept, like the environment, sort of connect everything. So a concept for this blended format was place. So they had a couple of weeks beforehand, and then when they came to the museum, there were 2 exhibitions that focused on the work of artists that dealt with place. One was American landscape impressionist Charles Hassam, and then a contemporary artist installation. This is Greg Lindquist, an artist originally from North Carolina that's now in New York. So they were able to talk with the curator of the Hassam exhibition and Skype with the artists in New York and have those experiences on site as well as working in the galleries. They also created studio work in the studio that complemented this, this learning, and how they were going to be able to take some of these ideas back to the classroom. Then in the improve phase, we pulled all of the data that we learned from all of these different programs, and we began to think about which ones that we would be able to continue and sustain and revise, the strongest ones, and the ones that we're going to put aside for a few years. So find the prototypes. We have really spent months now writing grants, and most of them have just been secured very recently, and also partnering with other statewide institutions, because that's key for our survival and to sustain these programs, is these partnerships with the Department of Public Instruction in North Carolina for all the public schools, the government-funded schools, et cetera. So beginning to look at this and then sustaining these skills. The biggest lessons that I learned to share with you today. The first, looking at technology as a tool in and of itself. And this is a complication for writing grants because funders like technology. They're going to love the sexy bells and whistles of the new technology that you're bringing into your museum. But avoiding that temptation and thinking about the right technology that serves the goals of what you're trying to do. How does it address the needs of your learners, the needs of your audience, and choosing the appropriate tool to meet those needs? The second thing, and we've incorporated this into all of the different programs, the term flexible responsiveness. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're constantly changing, but we're constantly responding, not only, and this is why it's so hard to prepare for the future. It really is, because our audiences are changing, the tools that we work with are constantly changing. However, having a plan is possible, just constantly being able to respond and adapt as those changes are happening. And finally, involving stakeholders and the audience to truly co-create what serves them best was essential for us. It was messy. it took a lot of time. It was exhausting, and it required for each of those 4 grant-funded managers to manage relationships with the collaborative planning team and number of different thought processes, but it was invaluable, and it's part of everything that we do from this point forward. And it's as simple as beta testing new ideas with the group before we put it online and offer it to the public. But in beta testing it, we're not just asking for their feedback. There's an element of it that they're helping us to create together. I also definitely want to acknowledge this is not my project. I really cannot take full credit for this myself. There were 3 other grant managers for this project, Emily Kotecki, Jill Taylor, and Kristen Smith, as well as a number of other staff members, the collaborative planning team that I'm sharing. I'm not going to read all of these names for you, but as well as the 10 thought partners that we are still continuing to work with. And then finally, this project would not have been possible without the U.S. IMLS, and hopefully they'll still have funding and not be cut in the next budget cycle. But all of these things were very crucial for this project. It wouldn't have happened without it. Here's my content information. I've also listed the website that you can download this PowerPoint, and I'll also include some of the handouts for this as well. Thank you.